On May 10th, the outlawed king and his desperate band of heavily outnumbered yet hardened guerrillas prepare their defences against the coming English onslaught. The king is Robert the Bruce, and the year is 1307, a full 7 years off from his most famous battle, Bannockburn. Yet arguably it would be here at Loudoun Hill that the fate of this fugitive king and that of his kingdom would be truly decided. The rise of Robert the Bruce can be traced to the death of King Alexander III in 1286. Alexander was a tragic figure, having lost both his male heirs in the early 1280s and then a daughter in 1283. However, Margaret had married the King of Norway and produced a daughter, so that when Alexander himself perished after falling from his horse in 1286, Scottish hopes were laid on the fragile shoulders of the 3-year-old Margaret, the Maid of Norway. Margaret too soon perished of seasickness before she could be crowned, and the Scottish succession was blown wide open, with many candidates vying for the throne. Unfortunately for the Scots, the King of England at this time was the particularly imperialistic Edward I, also known as the Longshanks due to his great height and stature. Edward had tried to arrange a match between his own son and heir, Edward, and the Maid, so that a natural merging of the realms would eventually occur. The Scots made the mistake of appealing to Edward to arbitrate the succession dispute, but perhaps feeling robbed of the natural synthesis of the realms that the marriage would have achieved, demanded that the Scots recognise him as Scotland's overlord, which they reluctantly eventually did. 2 candidates emerged with the greatest claims, the first being John Balliol and the other Robert de Bruce, grandfather of the Bruce. Both men were descendants of King David of Scotland, yet ultimately King Edward elected for Balliol in 1292, given he was probably the most amiable to his control, and would dutifully provide money and troops, as was his duty as a vassal. Yet weakness in the new king was not exclusively exploited by Edward. John effectively became the puppet of his nobles, who urged resistance to Longshanks' demands, refusing to supply troops for Edward's war against the French. Not only this, but the Scots also formed a mutual assistance pact with the French, later to be known as the Alde Alliance, in October of 1295. The agreement stated that if either kingdom were invaded by England, that the other would invade English lands, thus in theory splitting English forces. In March 1296, in accordance with the agreement, the Scots invaded Cumberland and besieged Carlisle, following news that England and France were at war. This attack failed, given Carlisle was held by Robert de Bruce, 6th Lord of Annandale, for the English. The Bruces at this point were loyal to King Edward. As for Edward, he decided to invade what he regarded as rebellious vassals, infamously sacking the border town of Berwick-upon-Tweed, in which it was said that the river itself flowed red with the blood of the slain. Moving on after a month, Edward chased Balliol out of northern England, before the latter met Longshanks' lieutenant, the Earl of Surrey, in battle at Dunbar in April of 1296. The battle saw the Scots beaten, and in June of 1296, John Balliol himself finally submitted to King Edward, and was subjected to a humiliating piece of political theatre in which his regnal vestments were stripped from him. Effectively de-kinged, Balliol, the broken former monarch, was allowed eventually to head into exile in Italy under the Pope's protection. Edward Longshanks, meanwhile, set about further subjugating Scotland, notably removing the Stone of Destiny, or the Stone of Scone, even having a special chair constructed to house it, upon which all subsequent English and then British monarchs were crowned, up until Queen Elizabeth II, before it was eventually returned in 1996. Meanwhile, the Bruces were firm supporters of Edward against Balliol, and his supporters, notably the Cummins. With Edinburgh, Roxburgh and Stirling all in English hands, Edward returned south, thinking Scotland pacified. It was at this point, in May of 1297, that the rebellion of William Wallace flared up. During this period, Robert, who had initially been sent by Edward to help suppress the revolt, switched sides for a time, yet was not present at Wallace's great victory at Stirling. Robert was jointly made Guardian of Scotland, following Wallace's defeat just a year later at Falkirk, along with John Comyn, after Wallace had relinquished this title. However, the two men simply couldn't work together, and in 1302 Robert again switched sides, declaring for King Edward. This time, many Scottish nobles appeared to be warming to the idea of a Balliol restoration, which was anathema to the Bruces, who were Balliol's rivals for the crown. Edward too was winning the war, and so, for these reasons, Bruce practically threw in his lot with the English. In the years leading up to 1306, Robert likely worked behind the scenes to lay the foundations for his own bid for the throne. One huge obstacle to this was the person of John Comyn, who was not only a powerful supporter of the Balliol claim, but also had a strong claim to the crown himself. In the summer of 1305, Robert made a deal with Comyn that in exchange for Comyn setting aside his and Balliol's claim, he would cede all Bruce lands in Scotland. Comyn would thus support a revolt in favour of Bruce. However, this scheming backfired, as Comyn eventually betrayed the plot to Edward, causing Robert to flee the English court to avoid arrest. This set the scene for one of the most infamous incidents in this whole saga. Setting up a meeting with Comyn at the Greyfriars Monastery in Dumfries on February 10, 1306, Bruce accused Comyn of treachery, causing the two men to come to blows, despite being on sacred ground. Near the high altar, the confrontation ended with Robert stabbing his rival to death, though it was possible a retainer actually finished him off. Whatever the exact details of the murder, the immensity of the act must have weighed heavily on Robert. Not only had he killed a man in a church, a highly sacrilegious act, but also one of the most powerful men in Scotland, which would have dire consequences later on. Realising his mistake, Robert fled to the bishops William Lamberton and Robert Wishart, who supported him, but likely thought any action to seize the throne premature, given that Edward Longshanks still lived and would certainly move to crush them. Robert captured Dumfries Castle and was invested with a royal banner and regalia by Bishop Robert Wishart at Glasgow. Wishart furthermore absolved the Bruce of Comyn's murder and fully threw his support behind him, pressurising other clergymen to do the same, though his act earned him excommunication from the Pope. Just 6 weeks later, on 25th of March 1306, Robert the Bruce, 7th Lord of Annandale and Earl of Carrick, was crowned King Robert I of Scotland. The ailing Edward Longshanks was furious with the news and sent his lieutenant Aymer de Valence, the future Earl of Pembroke, as well as his son Edward, to punish the errant Bruce. The prince infamously marched under the dragon banner, trying to indicate that the usual rules of chivalry were suspended, and thus Robert could expect no mercy. Valence quickly established a camp at Perth by June, with his army drawn from men of the northern counties, making up a sizable 3,000 men. Notably too, Valence's host was supplemented by Comyn supporters. King Robert was not idle, however, and moved with around 4,500 of his own men to confront Valence in Perth on June 18th, demanding that he come out and do battle. It is probable that Robert had not heard the news of Edward's raising of the dragon banner, or his declaration of him as an outlaw, meaning all rules of chivalry had been laid aside. Valence had responded to the Bruce by denying the offer of battle, claiming it was too late in the day and that they would fight on the morrow. Robert knew Valence to be an honourable man, and so took this at face value, withdrawing his own force into the woods near Methven. This proved an almost fatal error. During that evening, with the Scots force drawing down for the night, Valence attacked, his force containing large numbers of archers and cavalry. The Scots were largely dispersed, unarmed and unarmoured, proving easy pickings for Valence's men, which included heavy horse. The royal army had to fight ferociously just to enable their king to flee the ambush. Robert himself was said to have personally unhorsed Valence during the bitter struggle, but was himself unhorsed 3 times before making his escape. Most of the king's army was not so lucky. Of the 4,500 men who fought at Methven, some 4,000 were either slain or taken captive. This heavy defeat was only compounded with another heavy blow struck by the MacDougall clan, who were loyal to the murdered Comyn at the Battle of Dalry, further reducing the Bruce's following. If this wasn't bad enough, another severe personal blow came when news reached Robert that the Prince of Wales had seized Kildrummy Castle, commanded by his brother Neil, and housing the king's wife, daughter, and sisters. Now Longshanks' son and heir held his family and had Neil executed by hanging, drawing, and quartering at Berwick upon Tweed in September. Even the bishops most directly responsible for Robert's rise to the kingship, William Lamberton and Robert Wishart, were taken. However, despite all this, King Robert himself crucially remained at large, an outlaw in his own kingdom. He locally recuperated in the Hebrides for a time. Such circumstances would likely break any normal man, but the Bruce was to prove that he was no ordinary man, fully committing himself to his cause. In February of 1307, Robert led his supporters back into mainland Scotland, the lessons of Methven firmly burned into their minds. Given his small numbers, he couldn't hope to win a conventional war against the English, and what was more, had internal problems to deal with, as was so brutally illustrated at Dalry after Methven. Bruce decided to take on these internal foes first, but was again frustrated by failure. At Loch Ryan, he lost 2 more brothers, Alexander and Thomas, both defeated by the men of Dungal MacDougall, and then sent to Carlisle, where they were executed. With the foray into Galloway cut brutally short, Robert had met with more success in his own invasion of his native Annandale region, where he could count on strong local support. Evading a local English garrison, Bruce scored his first minor victory at Turnberry, defeating the men of Henry de Percy in the outskirts of the castle, eventually forcing Percy's withdrawal. Aymer de Valence soon moved to counter this renewed threat from Bruce, likely being aware of the king's small numbers and hoping to pin down and crush him. With Robert's capture, he could snuff out Scottish resistance for good. However, Robert likely divined this intent, and unlike at Methven, was on high alert, carefully choosing where to confront his nemesis. In April of 1307, this approach proved fruitful. Valence received intelligence that the Bruce was based at the head of Glen Truel, and perhaps wanted to repeat his tactic of surprising him. In reality, it was Valence's larger force, mostly comprised of cavalry, compared to Robert's infantry force, that held the surprise. The area was essentially a narrow track, with a steep slope overlooking it, down which Valence sent his riders. Robert, making effective use of the terrain, sent his own men up the slope, having them release rocks and boulders down onto the English, causing heavy losses. This initial attack was followed up by arrow shot, and perhaps even a charge down the slope, which caused Valence to withdraw his men. This minor victory did much to boost the spirits of the Bruce's army, yet did not dampen Valence's resolve as he pursued Robert to Loudoun Hill. Up to this point, Robert had fought small guerrilla-type engagements, but now elected to stand and fight, despite being heavily outnumbered and with arguably inferior men. The Bruce had next to no cavalry, while Valence's 3,000 troops were almost exclusively horse, with Robert fielding only around 600 men. This number imbalance was mitigated, however, by the king's clever use of terrain. Robert picked the perfect ground to meet Valence's inevitable charge. He deployed his men on high ground, which was flanked by boggy ground on either side, with some woods guarding his rear and to the right of the advancing English. These natural features served the purpose of funneling the English assault into a single, predictable direction. Robert formed his infantry into schiltrons, using pikes and spears to form large hedgehog-like formations. well suited to facing massed cavalry charges. In addition to this choice of terrain, Robert had his men dig trenches, place sharpened stakes before their lines, and as Valence and his cavalry charged, their momentum was completely stalled. The result was nothing short of a medieval car crash in which men, horses, and cold steel meshed into a bloody and muddied mass, making for easy pickings for the Scottish defenders. Despite all this, the battle was still hard fought. King Robert himself, along with his brother Edward and the Black Douglas, leading his men in melee. After several hours, the Chilterns continued to hold, with no possibility of flanking the Scots. Valence led the remaining English off of the field of battle towards Bothwell. Unlike Glentrool, where the true extent of Robert's victory was debatable, at Loudoun Hill there could be no doubt that he had dealt a resounding defeat to the English, causing hundreds of casualties, and thus solidified his own position as the prime focus of Scottish resistance to English domination. Loudoun Hill then proved a decisive turning point in the war for Scottish independence. King Robert's cause only enhanced soon after by the death of his greatest threat, King Edward Longshanks himself, on July 7th, leaving the crown of England and his cause to his much less capable son, Edward of Carnarvon. It would be another 7 years before the decisive engagement with King Edward II at Bannockburn, but Loudoun Hill still deserves to be noted as the great victory that it was. Edward would eventually be deposed by his wife and a disaffected noble, ruling England on behalf of his successor, King Edward III, for a time. King Robert himself would continue to rule Scotland until 1329, the Treaty of Edinburgh-Northampton, recognising Scotland as an independent kingdom and Robert as its king. Robert the Bruce died on 7th of June 1329, passing the crown on to his son, King David II, who would rule for almost 42 years.